Hello and most welcome to 887. We're having a lovely day here, sitting here in some quiet, shaded area from the wind and enjoying myself. This is Heidegger 887, and we continue with a nice article of Susie Vrobel, which is an extract from her book Fractal Time, Why a Looked Upon Kettle Never Boils. And in this lecture we do a whole roundabout. We go back to where we started from almost 400 lectures ago. Both Ramachandran and Blakesley are appearing in this book. And it's in the example of diminished observer extensions. Ramachandran and Blakesley describe a patient who refuses to believe that his leg belongs to him, although it's obviously attached to his body. Rather than accepting it as being part of himself, he comes up with his elaborate explanations why the leg does not belong to him. This condition, which is well documented under the name neglect, shifts the observer-world interface towards the observer and sets an artificial cut within his own body. And I think that is an excellent example how this cut can be made everywhere. Subject and observed, I think that's a common one. And it's important to remember the cut can be made everywhere. And the cut that we usually make is random. It's different from each and every one when it comes to the subject observer. But we need to be specific and make a specific cut when it has to do with our own body and when it has to do what is our mind. And this is something we presently don't do at all because of we forgot. Metzinger describes the other extreme. And this is a patient who all day looks out of the window making sure the sun moves across the sky. The patient is convinced that the apparent motion of the sun is a result of his volitional act. This may be an extreme case, but then many managers and politicians find themselves in similar situation. The position of the interfacial cut determines which temporal rhythms are attributed to the observer and which to the outside world. Well, depending where you make the cut, the temporal rhythm that is attributed to yourself and the one to the world will be different. A static random cut will be problematic both for the observer and for the world. And a static random cut is, for instance, this division now, past and future. It's completely random. It does not it wants to reflect something in reality. It's a mirror reflection, or represent something in reality, and there we have the problem. It should be something active already, not something static. And a static cut won't do the trick. Positive feedback results in hardwired expectations, which give rise to self-delusions. These are next to impossible to dissolve by means of reasoning, let alone lecturing. Our temporal observer perspectives are defined by the fractal structures generated by nestings of rhythm or oscillations. And as our brain's output controls its input, rather than the other way around. Our fractal temporal interfaces are fairly immune to external perturbations. And that is very important. It's more coming out from the brain than coming in. And if you've gone wrong somewhere, if you make this cut static and you think that the world has time only by itself without interaction, you have locked yourself in a self-confirming system, and no outside perturbation can change that. And that's a very important lesson, both from Blakesley, Ramachandran and Metzinger. There is no outside perturbation, stimuli that can make you change your mind. This takes careful, meticulous observation, thinking, delving deep into the subject, and you also need a lot of information. How these are built up historically and what binds you to get rid of them. I have to add, there is no internal substance either. You can't take a drug, medicine, start jogging, cycling around the world, even going to a monastery. Nothing ever can change this internally either. It's a combination of internal, external, doing things with your body at the same time as trying to ease up these boundaries. And that weren't possible in the West before the event of quantum mechanics, the theorem of Gödel. They are not happenstances, they are the real world, a little bit more than perturbations. I think this perceptual lockdown or lockedness is very interesting, and it's also this thing we deem to be real. It's when the same thing returns as we give to the world, we say it's real. It should be the other way around. It should be something different, a difference of some sort. And that should lead us to the real world of differences, equivocations, and other stuff. That is also the message from Derrida. The lockdown becomes also something that happens to a book, where the material in the book becomes beyond one's perception. We don't partake in the book, you won't get anything from the book. The only thing you get is a sort of reflection of what you already have, and then you say that was the book. That's also the reason why one could say that the most defining trait in deconstruction is that it's done so carefully, so meticulous, so ordered. No regular reading is that ordered. It can't be done easily. All praise to Derrida, Foucault and Heidegger. Well, we go into page 10 here and sort of a conclusion in this extract. And Susie Vrobel continues with the following: in order to explain the way we perceive meaningful entities such as a tune or any other time series as a gestalt, we must assume two mutually independent dimensions of time. The first one is delta length and the other one is delta depth. The ability to fall for or resist simultaneous contrast shapes our temporal fractal interfaces. Contextualization generates delta depth. Thus, our observer perspective can be defined in terms of the number of nestings at our disposal. The resulting interfacial cut generates our very personal realities. This cut can lead to advantages or disadvantages. If my interfacial cut is valid for one observer frame only, namely mine, I may, as the individual who has generated his perspective, well be diagnosed as suffering from a cognitive disorder. The same is true for a group of individuals who are embedded in a larger context, and that's very interesting. We can be in a larger context and, so to speak, co-play this illusion, or what you call it. And this co-playing, we think that we share something with other people. And I think this is very very similar to Wittgenstein's Scarabée example. Before you really get into the experiment, you will think that when everybody says Scarabée, they mean the same thing as you have in your box. That is wrong. And it could be, the more people that are talking to each other about these things, the harder it could be to sort of leap out of this lockdown. They may be branded as suffering, the group I'm talking about, from a collective hallucination if the perspective does not match that of the individuals who make up the embedding context. Scientific paradigms are also subjected to and constrained by the interfacial cut set by the scientific community. Scientists who adhere to a scientific paradigm may be falling for a collective hallucination, which becomes hardwired as a result of positive feedback and results in an educated incapacity. That's very interesting. Educated incapacity. This is what the schooling system does today. They strengthens the tendency to be completely individual in your perception, and the educational system also strengthens this circular reasoning, where the things you send out is coming back and you see them as the same. Self-identity, also a thing from the mirror conception, and then you say they are real, therefore. And the lockdown becomes stronger for every day in the schooling system. It doesn't have to fall this way, but most usually it does. No one, well, almost no one is immune to this. And one of the things that really strengthen this is the world at large, or the position from nowhere idea. That is definitely a part of the Swedish schooling system. There is one world implicitly assumed somewhere in the schooling system, and just because it's implicitly assumed, there's not an outspoken hypothesis, it becomes so much stronger, and that enforces the idea of this observer from nowhere. Neither is there a pure participant, as this state would not allow for an observer perspective. It's also important. Individuals who approach a state of pure participation would find themselves suffering from oceanic boundary loss or dreadful self-dissolution. Our knowledge of the world is limited by perceptual and cognitive constraints. We cannot rule out that there may be observed participants' extensions we cannot yet assign to a physical or a mental cause. Private observer extensions cannot easily be pinned down by external observers, even when we think we can discern an unusual interfacial cut. We cannot judge from the outside what sort of interfacial cut a certain person has. That's beyond comprehension or beyond perception. I shall spare you a long excursion into anecdotal evidence for such phenomena, but on a lighter note, here is an example of an extended observer participant whose extension we may observe, but we cannot explain. He stands like a statue, this is a sight, become part of the machine, feeling all the bumpers, always playing clean, plays by intuition, the digit counters fall, that deaf and dumb and blind kid sure plays mean pinball. Rather good, actually. Just give me a second here. I will go over to script. What on earth is happening here? Sorry. I don't know what's happening here. Thank you for your patience. Well, I have to mention this with temporal resolution. And temporal resolution takes up the interesting thing that when people are under extreme stress, when maybe there's a bank robbery, time seems to slowen up, get slower, almost like slow motion. And this is not only subjective, we know that, because this slow motion can make it possible for people to react in a much more thought out and responsive way, a way that wouldn't be possible if time was sort of not that high resolution is the similar when looking at the Norwegian coast, and for every step you focus in, you get more and more fractality. The time has the exact same feature, so you can go into the same time. You will not leave the communal time. That is the usual problem if you don't have fractal logic. So you will just deepen the now, so to speak, while you are still participating in communal time. Actually, your participation in communal time will strengthen. You will be more able to respond to the rhythm of external time. And this is specifically obvious when we have acute stress, and people that are stress resilient, they get this slowed up time, which is a literal slowed up time, not subjective, not objective either. So I think this is what caught my eye in Susie Vrobel's nice book, and that made me understand that a deepening of time, maybe it goes out like this, means that you can still be in the same now as everyone else, but your time gets more extended, gets longer, and it gets deeper. And this is this extra thing, depth, that only fractals have. So if you have an idea of time being linear, you will not simply understand it, because you cannot perceive it. This makes fractals sine qua non for understanding the workings of time. There's a good guess that this worked perfectly well before we had any conception of linearity, before coordinate system was established. But since it was established, we've been, so to speak, locked down in this. So a good reason to think that people before linearity didn't suffer from this. But fractality, to understand that, will make your understanding of time even better than the one people living maybe in the Middle Ages or pre-linearity, because fractality is the true working of time. And this also explains why, when we're looking back at time to eventful moments and years with high simultaneity, many parallel events, time seems to be contracted, it speeds up, it flies. And that duration happens in the now. But if you go to retrobation or retrusion, duration, when you look at these high resolved events, they will look much longer in retrospect. While you're in them, it's speeded up, but afterwards it is like it's extended. I had that feeling many times. Eventful things, when a lot of things are happening, those years, those months, for instance vacations, they are very long in retrospect. While they are happening though, it's almost like they are speeding up. You're enjoying yourself. But if you look at uneventful moment, years with low simultaneity. This is the depth thing that we don't have in regular language, where there are few parallel events. Time is dilated, it slows down, it drags. Time feels extended. But if you look in retrobation, retrusion, or retrospect, you feel that the time span was short. And here we go into the very fractality. It's hard to understand, but it's a little bit like this. Duration is something we loosely associate with the notion of succession. Now we're talking about duration, not depth. A 2-hour train journey, for instance, may be pictured as a sequence of 121 minutes intervals, lined up along an imaginary time axis like a bead on a string. The string is a one-dimensional structure. It extends on one level of description, thereafter denoted as LOD, only namely the level of successive minutes. On another LOD, say, the level of successive hours, the extension of the train journey would amount to 2 hours, not 120 minutes. This would still be a one-dimensional extension, albeit on a different LOD. Admittedly, such a concept of duration would be sufficient for most purposes, such as comparing the temporal lengths of train journeys. However, when we wish to compare the subjective duration of a train journey, we will find that one dimension, namely succession, is not enough. As we shall seek to demonstrate in this chapter, simultaneity is also needed. We shall also look how duration comes into existence in the first place, how the combination of successive and simultaneous events leads to the nested structure of now, and how we can quantify and compare subjective duration. This is extremely interesting because this is very similar to quantum time. Quantum time also have these two factors. It has duration, but it also has depth. So if we have something scaled off, one only event between two photons or two molecules or atoms, you can have a duration take on it. But as soon as we get into the real world, because there are many things happening at the very same time, we have parallel happenings all over the place, and then no longer does it work with a linear time, because we get different nows in a way. We get different nows because we don't have localization in the ordinary manner. Why is that? Well, we don't have an origo in the quantum mechanics. So in that case, we don't have a localizable event or a localizable atom or Higgs boson within the XYZ system. It's non-localized, and that shows you cannot have a persistent now either. So you see, location and now in the old way go hand in hand. They reinforce each other, but is the one broken, for instance localization, the other one becomes broken as well. And that for me shows their codependency. It's a very good example, and we haven't mentioned a lot of that because we haven't talked about that much about time. But now when we're doing it, I start to understand better and better that non-localizable events, non-localizable things like in the Heisenberg indeterminate theorem do has its equivalence in time. And the idea of time in Newton is oversimplified, Well, simply wrong, because it's making a interfacial cut in a static way without explaining where it is, and therefore creating this ghost-like origo, which can never be defined in actual physics, i.e. quantum mechanics, and therefore we get this phenomena, which is a shade phenomena. It's a consequence of the old physics, and we put in the new physics in the old physics, and then we get non-localized phenomena. We can localize in a way if we have depth, though. If we take in all parallel processes, it's getting easier and easier for each axial parallel process. It won't be exactly, but exactness is always connected to the old physics, or the illusion of exactness. So there are three things that tag along, so to speak, three brothers that helps to build this castle of classical physics. One is simultaneity in the old way, one is now, and the third one is here. And they go together to construct this Newtonian worldview, or Cartesian coordinate system, with a single timeline. And before you scratch the surface, it seemed to be working, but once you get into it, which is a rather fitting metaphor because it is on the depth side, when we have many parallel events, which we have in reality, we don't only have one event, then we strand into problem, and then it seems that we don't have one consistent now. Also something that often said by my ex-idol Carl Sagan: there's no now in the universe because of the time dilation caused by Einsteinian relativity. Well, there is a now, but not in that way, not in the Newtonian way. I think this is a good time to end. Speaking about time, tempus fugit and all that, I am going to make a carpe diem today and rush everything and go into my nested time that combines parallel events with singular nows. Say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.